In this video, we're going to build a Django middleware class that allows us to perform standardized logging in Django applications whenever a request comes into the application. And in the process of building this class, we're going to learn how to define middleware in Django. We're going to learn how to set up the Python logging module in order to log out request and response information. And we're also going to learn how to centralize these logs using 𝗵𝗽𝗀. And centralizing those logs is going to allow us to efficiently search through the logs and also to perform analysis on our log data. Now, before we start, it would be amazing if you would give the video a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the 𝗵𝗽𝗀 channel for more of this content. Now let's dive in. Let's start by explaining what middleware is, and we're going to reference the Django documentation here. And as it says, middleware is a framework of hooks into Django's request response processing. And it's a low-level plug-in system for globally altering Django's input and output. And each middleware component is responsible for doing some specific function. And as an example, Django includes a middleware called the authentication middleware. And what that does is it associates users with incoming requests using Django's session framework. So that's the purpose of that middleware. What we're going to do in this video is write our own custom middleware to output some logs and send those logs to 𝗵𝗽𝗀. Now if we scroll down a little bit here, we have a section on writing our own middleware. We're going to come back to that in a second, but I have a diagram from an older version of the Django documentation that I want to look at here, and this explains the kind of flow of this middleware. So what happens, as you can see on the left hand side, a request comes into the Django server. And that request passes through various middleware classes that perform their specific function. And each of these classes that you see here is defined in Django's middleware setting. Eventually, after passing through those middlewares, we reach the Django view function. And the view processes and generates a response. And that response is passed through the middleware again before it's sent back to the client. So a middleware allows you to amend the incoming request, for example, to augment it with information about the authenticated user, and it allows you to change up the response, and an example of that might be to add an HTTP header to the response. If we go back to the original documentation, the middleware functions or classes that we can write, they have access to the incoming request, and in that middleware we can generate the response and amend that response before returning it to the client. Now we're going to see that flow in action in this video when we write our logging middleware. What I'm going to do to start with is go to VS Code where I have an empty directory open, and we're going to activate a Python virtual environment using the 𝗵𝗻𝗽𝗀 module, and let's call this 𝗵𝗻𝗽𝗀 middleware demo. And once that's been created, we can activate the virtual environment by running the activate script. And what we're going to install here is the Django package, of course, and that's actually all we're going to need at the moment in this video. Now that pip install command will install Django into the Python virtual environment, and once that's installed we can clear the terminal, and we're going to use the Django admin command, and there is a start project command here, and let's call this middleware demo. It's a very simple project we're going to build here, and you can see that has created that project on the left hand side. We can cd into that directory, and then we're going to run python manage.py, and we're going to create an application within that project using the startup command, and we'll call that application core. And that, as you can see, has created that core directory here in the project. Now what I want to show you is the Django settings.py file to start with, so let's go to that now. And this file contains all of Django's settings for a given project. What we're going to do is we're going to look at one of these settings, and that is the middleware setting. This is set to a list in Python, and that list contains a variety of middleware classes here. For example, at the top we have the security middleware, we have Django's session middleware which handles sessions, and there are various other ones here as well, and here is the authentication middleware that was mentioned in the documentation. What we're going to do is we're going to write our own middleware class, and that class is going to allow us to perform some logging, and then we're going to send those logs to the terminal and then later on to 𝗵𝗽𝗀 where we can centralize and properly analyze those logs. So in order to write our own middleware, we're going to go back to the Django documentation, and this page here on middleware, which is linked in the description of the video, this contains a section on writing your own middleware, so let's reference that now. Now a middleware is a callable that takes a request and returns a response, just like a Django view, and it can be written as a function, as you can see here, and this function itself defines an inner function called middleware, and that's what's ultimately returned by that function. And you can also define middleware as a class. And a middleware class requires two functions. We have a dunder init method, that's the constructor essentially, and that sets up this get response callable that the middleware uses. And then we have a dunder call function, and what that does is it allows the class to be essentially callable in Python. and that method takes the request as a parameter, and what happens here is it generates a response by calling that getResponseCallable. And there are two places where you can insert some logic into the middleware. You can do it before you generate the response, and that code will be executed for each request that comes into Django, and it will be executed before the view or any later middleware are called. So when a request comes into the URL in your Django application, any code that we define before we call getResponse in the middleware, that is going to be run before that request hits the view function. So it allows you to change up the request object and other things in the request before the request comes to the view, and then after you generate the response, before you return it at the bottom here, you can execute code here that can do things like change the HTTP headers or anything like that, and that is executed after the view function has returned. And again, we'll see this flow in action very shortly in the video. So let's now define our own Django logging middleware. What we're going to do is go back to this directory here that contains a Django project, and we're going to go to the core application, and I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call it middleware. And in that folder, let's create an init.py file here in order to allow us to reference the classes in this folder. And we're going to create another file, and I'm going to call this logging.py. Now in this file, we're going to define our Django middleware, and we're going to do some logging. So we're going to start at the top by importing the Python logging package. And we're going to set up some logging code in a second, but to start with, let's define a class here, and I'm going to call this logging middleware. And we don't actually need these parentheses, so let's get rid of those. And we need two methods in this class, the dunder init method. And what that takes is self, but it also takes a getResponseCallable, and that is automatically injected by Django. And what we can do here is set the getResponseCallable on the class itself, so self.getResponse. We're going to set that to what comes in as a parameter, and then we need to define the dunder call method as well. And again, it's a method on a class, so self is the first argument. And it also takes the Django request, so let's pass that in as well. And let's again outline the structure of a Django middleware. The logic that's executed before the request can be put at the top of the function. What we then do is we generate the response by calling self.getResponse and passing the request into that. That's going to then forward the request to the next middleware or to the Django view function, and then it will return to us the response. And if we need to amend the response, we can do that below where we get this response. So this is logic that would be executed after the view is called. And finally, we return the response. So that's the standard workflow for a middleware. Let's now go to the top, and what we're going to do is we're going to define a logger object. So let's create a variable called logger, and we're going to call the logging.getLogger function. I'm going to pass the name of this module into that function. Now these loggers can be defined using the dictionary configuration approach, and you can check out our video on Django logging for that, but we're only going to be logging from this one file, so I'm just going to set up the logger in the file directly. We're going to define a handler next, and that's going to be a logging.streamHandler in Python, and a stream handler by default is going to just output the logs to the terminal. We're also going to create a formatter that defines the output format of our logs, so we're going to instantiate a logging.formatter object. And the format that we're passing in here is going to be a string, and I'm going to reference some fields here. So we're going to have the time, and that's going to be of type string, and we're also going to have the level name. So for example, if we log out with a level of, let's say, debug or info or error, that's going to appear here by using the level name directive. And there's one more I want to do, and I'm going to separate this with a semicolon. We also want the log message to be output, and again that's going to be a string. Now we're going to see an example of this format very soon. There's a couple of extra steps here. We're going to set this formatter on our handler, so we can do that by accessing the formatter attribute on the handler object, and we're going to set that to the formatter that we created on the line above. And then finally we're going to add the handler to the logger itself using the logger.addHandler function, and we pass the handler into that. Now there's one last line of code I want to write here. We're going to set the level on the logger object, and we're going to set that to logging.info. And what this means is that any log records with the level of info, or any level that's more severe than info, are going to be output by this logger object. So now that we've done this, we're going to go down to the logging middleware, and we're going to go to the dunder call method. And this is where we're going to write the logic for this middleware. Now we're going to start simple here, and we're going to log out some basic details. When the request comes in, we want to log out the request.method property, and that could be a get request or a post request or a delete request and so on. We're also going to log out the IP address of the incoming request. So if you send a request to Django, we're going to get that IP address and log that out. And finally, we're also going to log out the URL path for the incoming request. So this is data that's on the request object, so we're going to log these out before we call the self.getResponse function to get the response from the Django view. What we're going to do here is create a Python dictionary called request data, and that's going to contain the keys for those fields I mentioned. So for example, the method, that's going to be equal to the request.method property. We're also going to get the IP address here, and what we need to do in Django to get the IP address, one way to do that anyway, in a very basic form, is to look at the request.meta dictionary, and we can get a key in that dictionary called remote address. And I'm going to add one more key to this dictionary, and that's going to be the path for this incoming request, and that's going to be very simple, just request.path. Now the idea here is that we have this information in a dictionary, and we want to log that out using this logger that we have above, and using any handlers that are configured on that logger. So we're going to use the logger, and we're going to use the level methods on the logger object. So let's go below this dictionary, and I'm going to use the logger.info method, and we're going to log out this information to our handlers. So let's pass in the request data here, and that's going to log that to our stream handler before we call the getResponse method. So how do we actually get this to work in Django? What I'm going to do is go back to settings, and actually before I do that, let's copy the name of this middleware. We need to get a reference to this middleware, and we need to add it to the Django middleware list. So how is that done? Let's go to the bottom of that list. What we need to do is we need to reference the application where this middleware lives, and that application was called core, as you can see on the left hand side, and the middleware is in a directory called middleware, so we're going to reference that now. So it's core.middleware, and it's the logging.py file, this one here, where our middleware class is defined. So we're going to say core.middleware.logging, and finally we can paste the name of the class itself, and that's logging middleware. So we're just setting the path to this middleware class, and we're adding that to Django's middleware list. What we can do now is test this out. So I've expanded the terminal, and we're going to start Django's development server, and then we're going to visit localhost 8000, and you can see that page here. It contains the default Django installation page. If we go back to VS Code and we look at the terminal, we can actually see our log record that has been output here, and it contains the log in this format that we specified when we set up the formatter. So we have the time at the start of the log, and then we have the level name of info, and you can see that portion of the log record here. And then finally we have the Python dictionary that we set up, and that contained the request data, and that was the message that was sent to the logger.info method. So that's appearing on our terminal, and that's sent there by the logging.stream handler. So we know now that this is working fine. This middleware is being called, the _call method is being executed, and it's logging out some data to the terminal based on the request data that we set up here. Now, as well as the request, we can also log out information about the response. So we get the response here on line 25 by calling that getResponse function and passing the request in. And that gives us back a Django HTTP response object that we can then amend. And we don't need to just amend that, we can access information that's on the response object, and that's what we're going to do now. So let's get rid of this comment, and I'm going to set up a variable called response dictionary, and we're going to set that with one key initially, and that's going to be the status code of the response. We can get that by looking at the response.statuscode property, and again, once we have that, let's use the logger.info method, and we're going to pass the response dictionary through to that method. Now I'm going to save this again, and let's go back to the Django page and refresh this page. That's going to send a request into the Django application. That request will pass through all of the middleware, and that includes the one that we have here. And if we look at the terminal output, we now also get some output for the status code. Now what this means is that both of these logging statements here are being executed in the middleware, and we're logging out this useful information on every request that's coming into the Django application. Let's add another example, and this one could be useful in your applications. We're going to log out the time it took for the request to be processed and to generate the response. Now in order to do that, at the top I'm going to bring in the Python time module, and we're going to do this in the _call method. So what we're going to do right at the start of that method is we're going to get a reference to the start time by calling the time.time function, and that will give us the start time when the request entered into this middleware. And then after we call the getResponse function, that gives us back a response object, and that means that the request has been processed by the Django view and we're ready to return the response to the client. What we're going to do at the bottom of this method is we're going to get a duration here. So let's set a variable called duration. We're going to call time.time again, and we're going to subtract the start time that we calculated at the beginning of this middleware. And that gives us a start time, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move this up to here just after we get back the response, and I'm going to add a new key to the dictionary called duration, and we're going to set that to the duration variable. And let me fix some of these lines here so that this looks a bit nicer. So let's recap what's happening here. What we're doing at the start of the middleware is we get a reference to the current timestamp, and then after we've generated the response, we find the duration and we're adding that to the log dictionary for the response. Let's test this out by going back to our Django page, and I'm going to refresh this page and go back to the terminal, and you can see at the bottom we now have a duration, and it's a very small duration because this particular request is not doing anything complex, it's just returning a template. So we get the status code of 200 and a very small duration in that response dictionary. And above that we get the request dictionary, and we can see that the method was a get request. We have the given IP address for localhost, and we have a path as well here of the root URL. Now, calculating these durations might be useful in your application. It would allow you to detect whether you have a particular URL or view that is not performing as expected, and you can then take steps to address that problem. What we're going to do now is we're going to send our logs not only to the terminal but also to BetterStack, where we can centralize those logs and we can analyze and filter the logs, and that's much more useful for our developers and administrators. We're going to learn how to do that in this section of the video. What we need to do at the top of this file, when we set up the logger and its handler, we're now going to add a second handler to that logger, and that's going to send the log output to a different location, in other words to BetterStack. So to start with, let's go to the BetterStack platform, and what we're going to do is create a log source. And a source in BetterStack represents a service that you want to collect logs from. And an example, of course, would be a Django application, but it could also be things like a database or a cache or other services. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a source by clicking this button, and we're going to provide some basic information. So let's give the source a name of Django demo, and the platform for this is going to be Python. We can then hit the create source button, and what we get back here is some information, including a source token that we're going to copy to the clipboard. Now what I'm going to do is go to VS Code, and at the top of our logging.py middleware file, I'm going to paste a variable here with that token. Now in a real application you would of course store the token in the environment variables or the environment file, and it should under no circumstances be committed to GitHub or GitLab or any other source control system. But for the purposes of this video, let's just paste the token directly, and we're going to create a second handler below the one that we already have, and I'm going to call that one BetterStack handler. And we need to set this to something, but what I need to do first of all is I need to install the BetterStack Python driver. So let's stop the server at the bottom here, and I'm going to go to a page on the BetterStack documentation on Python logging. So let's go back to the browser, and this is the page on Python logging. What we need to install is the BetterStack Logtail Python package. So let's copy that and go back to the terminal, and we're going to run pip install, and we're going to install Logtail Python into this environment. And once that's done, we can clear the terminal and go back to the browser. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this up using the logging from Python section. So if we go down here, what we need to do is import the Logtail handler from that package, and we need to instantiate that object and pass in our source token. So let's copy the import statement and go back to the logging.py file. And I'm going to minimize the terminal. At the top, let's paste in that Logtail handler, and then underneath where we defined the token, I'm going to move up the BetterStack handler variable, and we're going to instantiate that Logtail handler. And we pass a keyword argument of source token, and we can set that equal to the token above. And once we have that handler, we can copy that, and then down just a bit below here we have the logger.addHandler method. We can call that again in order to add our new BetterStack handler to the Python logger object. Now, as I said earlier in the video, this can be set up with the Python dictionary configuration settings. And I'm going to go to this Django logging page where we can see that in action. So on the right hand side we have a section on configuring logging, and in order to configure it we have a setting called logging in the setting.py file, and in that setting we can define the configuration for our loggers using a Python dictionary, but we're not going to do that as I said in this video. Let's just stick to declaring these in line. Now once we have the BetterStack handler added to our logger, that means that when we call the logger.info method, as well as going to the terminal, these are also going to be sent to BetterStack where we can centralize them, and that's going to provide a much better developer experience in production. So let's now save the logging.py file, and we're going to start up the Django server again. And let's navigate back to the Django default page here, and I'm going to refresh this page a couple of times in order to generate some logs. Now if we go back to VS Code, you can see we're still getting the output on the terminal, and that's because we still have a stream handler that's being added to our logger. But we now have two handlers, and the other handler is going to send those log records to BetterStack. So let's go to BetterStack now, and we're going to go to the live tail for this log output. And you can see the logs are now being sent to BetterStack, and you can see them displayed in this live tail. Now let's click the top one here, and we're going to see what we have in this log record. And you can see that BetterStack has extracted some details, for example the file name of logging.py that generated this log record. We have the level of info, and we also have the message which is set to that Python dictionary. Now you can see that that message has been stringified. It's the string representation of that dictionary, and we have a severity number here that comes from the log level, and we also get the timestamp of course as well. Now if we go back to the live tail here, these are all info records, but we could in theory filter the logs by the level, and all we need to do in order to do that is just click the name of the level that we want to filter by, and that's going to remove anything that's not part of that log level. Now one thing I want to show just before we finish the video is that the output that we have in the message, we cannot use that in an intelligent way because it's not being output in a structured format. We just have a string version of a dictionary, but ultimately that is a string. We cannot extract, for example, the IP address from that. What I want to show at the end of this video is how we can get the keys and values out of that dictionary, and how we can let BetterStack index that information and allow us to search on those fields. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to scroll down here to our logger.info calls. Now what I'm going to do, as well as passing through the request data as the message, we're going to pass a key called extra here. And again, we're going to pass that dictionary as the value for that key. So we're passing the dictionary as the message itself, but we're also passing it as the extra key. And by passing it as the extra key, we're going to allow BetterStack to extract that information from the dictionary. And I'm going to do the same just below here for the response dictionary. So let's define that extra key, and we're going to set that to the response dictionary. Now we can go back to the browser, and I'm going to go back to the Django installation page, and again let's do a couple of requests. And in fact, just to show this, I'm going to go back to VS Code, and let's change this to logger.error. It doesn't really make sense with the dictionary that we have here, but I'm just going to show how we can filter on BetterStack itself. And if we generate some logs here, they're going to be sent to the live tail. So let's go back to the live tail now, and at the bottom you can see we're now getting those error messages, and if I click that, we're going to filter the logs, and here you can see that we only see the error logs. Now let's go back to the live tail again, and I'm just going to click one of the logs at the bottom here. So let's extract the information from that, and when we view the fields that we have here, you can see we now have fields like IP address and the request method here below, which is set to get. These are now keys that are available in this log output, and we can now search through the logs for values on those keys. So as an example of that, if I wanted to get all requests that had a method of get, what we can do is we can type the name of that key, which is method, and then we're going to look for an equality here, and we're going to set it equal to get. When we click search, we get back all of the log records that contain a key of method that's set to get. And the searches that you define don't need to be equalities. We can also provide a contains expression if we're working with string data. And we also have the inverses of these. So for example, does not contain and not equal to. So we have some very flexible search parameters on BetterStack, and that allows us to find the information we need from our log records, and that's very helpful for analysis and for debugging. And that's all I want to show in this video. Let's go back to VS Code. What we've done in this video is we've written a Django middleware class that allows us to log some useful information from the request on each request response cycle. Now one thing to note is that when we send our logs to BetterStack, that's going to send those logs over the network, and that could introduce some latency to your application. Remember that middleware are executed on every request response cycle, and that means that every time a request comes into Django, you're going to be sending those network requests across the wire to BetterStack, and that can definitely impact performance, but there are options for fixing this. Now one way to avoid that would be to log to something like a file and use a service like Vector or FluentD, and these services can then collect the logs from that file separately and send that information across the network to BetterStack without impacting your application performance. We also have options in Python as well. We could use the Celery module to offload the network calls to a separate worker process. And we could also use the Python queue handler and queue listener objects. And again, these would allow you to take these logging calls over the network and offload them away from the request response cycle. If you're interested in any of those approaches, let us know in the comments. But that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed it, give the video a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to BetterStack for more of this content. And we'll see you in the next video.